Open your books to page number 515. Page number 515, we'll go ahead and get started today with our lesson. Probably not going to be too awful long today because some of the things in this lesson that is on the test is actually not going to be on your test. I'm amending the test for this chapter because there are a lot of treaties you need to learn, and in order, there are tests, there are treaties that you need to know. And then there are some treaties that I'm just going to not make you learn. I don't think that they're necessarily necessary. But you are going to get the high points of these treaties. So it is going to be a little bit shorter. You'll have less, hopefully, to write down. So, talking about World War One. So World War One comes to an end. It's a bloody war in which thousands and thousands of people died. Well, how's it going to end? Well, it ends at a peace conference in Paris in the year 1919. So 70 delegates from representing 32 nations meet to negotiate the peace settlement for World War I. And some of the dominant leaders that were at the conference was Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, George Clemenceau, who was the Premier of France, and David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So these were some of the people that were present at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, it's interesting. We've mentioned this before. Germany got saddled, and we'll discuss it more in depth as we go. But Germany got saddled with most of the blame for the war. In all reality, yes, you could blame them, but also they weren't the ones that fired the first shot. The ones that fired the first shot was Serbia, and they got literally nothing. You're talking about, they didn't even get a slap on the wrist. It was all Germany, because Germany gave them carte blanche to do basically anything, and they were always going to back them up. And so Germany would end up getting the fuzzy end of that lollipop. So these are the representatives of all of the major countries at the Paris Peace Conference. Meanwhile, President Woodrow Wilson, he includes his plan to end the war in what's been known as the 14 points. These 14 points didn't want to seek revenge upon the defeated powers. When he arrived in Europe, enthusiastic crowds welcomed him wherever he went. Why shouldn't they? Because the American troops provided the respite that the European armies needed. Again, I don't mean to degrade the sacrifices made by the French and the British soldiers that had been already fighting in Europe for 4 years. I don't mean to degrade their sacrifice, but they were at a stalemate, and they were tired, and the Americans came in. They hadn't been involved in this war. They were all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they provided reinforcements that allowed this war to end very quickly. Well, very quickly. It was a year and a half. But it wasn't without sacrifices. There were so many Americans lost because General Pershing, his philosophy of war was just, none of this trench warfare. We're just going to bum rush the trenches and take the Germans by surprise. So the Americans basically won the war, not because they were better soldiers necessarily, but because they were just fresh troops. That being said, America has the greatest military in all the world. So I'm just saying that. To any of our French and British listeners that might be offended by what I just said. Okay. So the 14 points that President Wilson put together said, listen, we don't want any of the defeated nations to be treated harshly. You see those 14 points on page number 516. The first one, open covenants of peace. And then number 2, absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas. Number 3, the removal of economic trade barriers. Number 4, armament reduction. 5, adjustment of colonial claims. Number 6, the evacuation of all Russian territory. Number 7, Belgium must be evacuated and restored. Number 8, all French territory should be freed and invaded portions restored. Number 9, Italy's borders should be readjusted along the clearly recognizable lines of nationality. Number 10, the people of Austria-Hungary should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development. Number 11, the independence of the Balkan states must be maintained. Serbia must be given an outlet to the sea. So right here, Serbia is actually getting a pretty good deal here, and they were the ones that started the whole thing. And then non-Turkish peoples under Turkish control should be given the opportunity of autonomous development. Number 13, the independent Polish Free State should be erected with free and secure access to the sea. And then lastly, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to the great and small states alike. So these were President Wilson's goals. He didn't want Germany to have to face a lot of economic reparations for what they had done, simply because that would throw the world into an economic depression. Guess what? It propelled the world into economic depression because they didn't listen. And listen, President Roosevelt, folks, if I say President Roosevelt, I'm meaning President Wilson. President Wilson was a big government guy. By the way, he went to college at Davidson College here in North Carolina, where Steph Curry also went to college. So two notables right there, two notable alumni, Woodrow Wilson and Steph Curry here in North Carolina. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson was a big government liberal. I'm a small government conservative. That being said, Wilson's 14 points was a better peace plan than the ones that were actually proposed by the peace conference. And I'll discuss why. The treaty they ended up going with, it wasn't the 14 points. They made what's called the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had several different requirements. And this is just some of them. Not all of them, but some of them. You need to know these. The results of the treaty, number 1, Germany was saddled with the blame for the war. This is called the War Guilt Clause. You need to know that. Germany was saddled with the blame for the war. Again, you can't really say Germany didn't. You can't say that Germany wasn't deserving of a lot of the blame, because they gave the carte blanche to Austria-Hungary to do whatever they wanted. But it's a little bit. You can't blame them for everything. I'm just saying, and I'm not advocating German nationalism here. Okay, another result: Poland had to be established as an independent country. Poland had not really existed in a long while, but it had to be reestablished. German industrial heartland had to be surrendered to France. That will become very important in the coming years. And then finally, Germany had to demilitarize. At the very least, they had to lower their military aims, but basically, it resulted to demilitarization. They had to get rid of their military, basically. Obviously, this is not really going to help a whole lot of people in Germany, because this is just going to hamstring them in their economy. And tomorrow we'll get into the economic problems that the Treaty of Versailles had for the Germans and the world at large, because this propelled the world into a Great Depression. So this is heavy stuff here. Now, not only all of this, I didn't put it on here, but Germany had to pay reparations, which was payment for war damages. So basically, they had to pay all the countries back for all of the problems that they had caused. Which I'm not necessarily against reparations. The problem was the due dates that Germany had to meet were incredibly unreasonable. Not only that, the German industrial heartland had to be given to France, meaning they could not come up with the money to pay anybody, because France took their industrial heartland. They took, imagine in America, imagine Pittsburgh, where steel is very important. Imagine Detroit, where a lot of cars are made. Imagine Texas. Imagine California. And not Antelope Valley, is it Simi Valley? The one with Apple and all of the tech companies. Any one of those places that make millions of dollars for the United States. Imagine all of them being taken away and being required to hand up war reparations. It's not going to work, because you're forcing them to also get rid of all of their money-making apparatuses. So that caused a huge economic depression, but we'll get into that tomorrow. Okay. Moving on. Okay. So, what are mandates? So, the Treaty of I'm trying to say this, it's French. Sevres, which was the Treaty of Sevres. You don't need to know about the treaty, but you need to know that the Treaty of Sevres ended up dismantling the Ottoman Empire. Look at a map from World War One, and you see Turkey. Turkey was considered part of the Ottoman Empire. What happens is the Treaty of Sevres basically dismantled that empire. The Turks retained Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, where they constituted the majority of the population. The Arabian territories, however, such as Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, came under British and French control. These territories, as well as the former German colonies, were called mandates, which were territories technically under the control of the League of Nations, but administered by various allied countries. Now, what is the League of Nations? I am glad you asked. This is on page number 520. The League of Nations was an organization designed to discuss differences rather than fight over them. Basically, it was the UN before the UN was a thing. And President Woodrow Wilson was the biggest fan of the League of Nations, and he wanted the U.S. to join. He campaigned in favor of the U.S. joining, but the Senate didn't ratify the treaty. Americans didn't want to be part of the League of Nations, which basically resulted in it eventually falling apart. And also, it didn't help the fact that Wilson had a stroke. So he kind of had to stop going out on the campaign trail and endorsing the League of Nations. He had a stroke in which it affected half of his face. In fact, after the stroke, he began to grow his beard out, so that way visitors couldn't tell that half of his face was basically paralyzed. And it would regain much of its ability to speak later, but for the short term, he grew a beard out so people wouldn't see that he had a stroke. In fact, during this time, after he had the stroke, basically wasn't the vice president, wasn't the Speaker of the House. His wife basically ran the country. She forged his name on documents and pretty much ran the country. A lot of people refer to her as the first woman president, even though she wasn't the first woman elected, because she basically ran the country for him when he was recuperating. So the League of Nations was established, and in an effort to prevent future war from happening. And then you have the Washington Naval Conference. This was an attempt to disarm the great naval powers in the early 1920s. That includes the U.S., Germany, and Britain. So basically, they wanted to get rid of all of the navies. All right, we are going to go ahead and stop there with that for today. Go ahead and remember you've got to read this section because, again, I went through this very, very quickly. But make sure you're reading. Make sure you're doing the daily questions. Make sure you're actually putting forth the effort. And I want you guys to know that I always love you and I'm praying for you. And I don't want you to take that for granted. I really do love you guys. And, we only have about 2 weeks left of class. And, I'm going to miss you guys. I really am. I hate that this year we haven't been able to really have a normal class because of all of this, and I really hate it because I loved teaching you guys. I love getting to know you guys. You're a great class. I'm just really thrilled to have been a part of your education for this past semester, and I do want you guys to know that I love you and I'm always praying for you.